It's a good thing.
All right. Yay. Well, happy Monday morning. I'm Dana Williams. I'm thrilled to be here with Micah and H, our buddies. We talk every other week on a leadership topic, and we've been focused the last, 6 weeks, I think, or 4 weeks on what it is like to transition as a leader. And we talked about initially what it's like when you're a new leader and you're in between jobs, and how do you lead with your strengths. And then we've been talking about leadership onboarding and what does that look like. And today, H is going to lead us into a discussion of, what it looks like in the different functions as you go through a transition. So, again, my name is Dana Williams. I have my own business, which is Dana Williams Consulting, and I work with corporate leaders and individuals and really focus on helping them transform from the inside out through their Clifton Strengths. And I think that's one of the commonalities. We all are Clifton Strengths coaches and use Clifton Strengths as one of our tools. So I'll kick it off to you, Micah, and then you can kick it off to H.
All right, sounds good. Hi, everybody. My name is Micah Lawrence. I'm an ICF certified coach and a Gallup certified strengths coach, and I do leadership coaching with startup founders and small business owners, as well as team development workshops with their teams. And this is the highlight of my week when we do these conversations, because what people don't see, and we'll probably talk about this
Don't
more,
tell
is
them.
no, we've got to share it because it's what makes it fun. What
I
people
know.
don't see is that for the 10 minutes before we actually go live, we just like chat about this stuff and all different possibilities, things that we could talk about in these conversations. And it's just fun to have the kind of dynamic with two other people where we can just chat about
Yeah.
Clifton Strengths, about leadership, about organizational functions and behavior. It's fun to have a group like this that we can talk about in intelligent strengths related conversations. It's my favorite. So
Yeah.
I'll hand it off to H.
Micah, and I agree with you. It's the fun part of the week, right? Where you just
No
get to be
rules.
creative. There's
Yeah.
no
Yeah,
there's
it
no
is
rules.
creative.
Well, there is a deadline. There's a timeline, but
We have a clock.
that's it.
But it's
You
also
probably get
self-imposed. It's like
That's
we
right.
made up this clock, so
That's right.
we could go on for hours. Nobody
That's
else would be
right.
here, but we could still
yeah.
do it.
So I'm H. Muir H is my first initial. That's what everybody calls me. My business is called Lift Shop. I work with brands, teams, and organizations to give them a lift in their development. So I work mostly with large companies, a lot of CPG companies, so consumer packaged goods. Yeah, and I do a lot of facilitation in that regard. So as Dana said, we've been on this topic, right, about leaders in transition. And last time we talked about, we leveraged an article that was in the Harvard Business Review from November, December. So you can see that, which was great, which was really interesting, called How to Succeed Quickly in a New Role. And it was really focused on four things, and those four things strongly correlated to the four domains. So the first thing was relationship, which Harvard says build a broad network and connect with those peers and cross-functional colleagues. Influence, the next one was generate pull, right? Find mutual wins, really seek to understand what other people's wins are. The S in strategy was identify how you add value. And we're going to talk a little more about that today. And then the last, execution, was really about how you create scale. And the fifth one that we talked about, and I think that Harvard touched on as well, was also account for your own well-being, right? You're the goose that lays the golden egg, so you got to tend to the goose. So that's kind of what we talked about last time. And by the way, if you've got questions or you're about anything, but frankly about leaders in transition, we'd love to hear from you. And you can, if you type it in the comments, we can't respond via text, but we will answer the question and talk about whatever you want to talk about.
Yeah, and I think I didn't really explain the why we're talking about this. There's like the problem we're facing, and you guys are seeing it. We're seeing it in our work. Is that I think H, you told us you had two different leaders that you were working with over the last month, and both of them have changed. And so there's a constant reshuffle going on right now. And so a lot of people are moving quickly and not thinking about where they're going, then going, uh-oh. And then other people have been thinking about it, but they're not sure quite how to assimilate. So that's why we've been spending a lot of time on this topic, because it is so relevant right now. So I wanted to bring in the why
Yeah.
and the problem
Good
we're
call.
talking about. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I've worked with, I think my last 3 clients, like the CEOs were in their jobs a year or less. And
Oh,
so
wow.
we were working on culture development. I'm working on an HR transformation with an organization, and their chief HR officer is, I think, less than a year. So,
Wow.
yeah, and that, I mean, that's got to be, you know, I think that's not a trend, right? That's the norm. It almost
That's
seems like.
Yeah.
And
it's
I
hap-
think one of the things we talked about before this, and we'll probably get into a little bit, is when there's new leader, there is change. Even from a team standpoint, you go back to forming,
Yep.
but a lot of times leaders are brought in to facilitate change, and we're going to talk some of that. The other thing we want to talk about, and we'll talk about it again in 2 weeks, there's 4 levels of assimilation. So we talked about it last time about here's keys to early success and follow the RISE model in the Harvard. But the other thing is to think about it from a context of 4 levels of assimilation. One is functional, the whatever business you lead, whether you're marketing or finance, what are the business cycles? What are the processes? How are those working in the business you lead? The other is organizational level, which is understanding the history of the organization, the culture of the company, the hierarchy, how things work across functions. The next is team. So assimilation of team is understanding the people that work for you and where that team is in their stage of development. And we'll try and talk about those 3 today, about functional, organizational, and team, and just some of the things that you should think about. And then the last one is personal, right? It's like, how do you stay grounded? How do you build your community? And we're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. And we're really going to focus on how do you establish and identify and establish your values, but also live those values, and do your values change as your role changes, given the role you have to play, given your assessment of the functional and team and organization. So that's kind of where we're at. I don't know, Dana, Micah, anything to add to
No,
that?
I think that's good. There's so much content on this right now, and it's changing as we speak. I think, H, when you were talking about your 2 leaders that were fairly new, I heard a stat last Friday that most companies now are going to have, you'd have some companies that were fairly well seasoned, that had been around for 25, 35 years. They might have people around 5 to 10 years. Now the average is going to be a year to 3 years of tenure of people. So how do you keep them engaged, and how do you keep them loyal, and how do you come in as that leader and bring that in? So I think as you think through these 4 different assimilation areas, it's really thinking about that too, and keeping that as a high point.
100% agree. And I think, when we're talking about this, the 3 levels of assimilation, I think we're really going to focus on functional and team, because organizational, it's just ramping up your knowledge. There's not a lot you can do there in terms of leading change. But let's talk about functional. And this kind of gets back to what I said in the Harvard model on their RISE, right? What's your strategy? Why were you hired? And there's a book that's called, Mike and I were just talking about, The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins. It's been around a while, but it's got really good tools in it. I always recommend it to anybody that's starting a new gig. And one of the things that Watkins talks about is, assessing from a functional standpoint and your functional assimilation. What's your role? What were you hired to do? And he uses the acronym STARS, right? So is this a startup, right, where your role is really to create momentum and keep the lights on? And Mike can probably talk a lot about, because he works with a lot of startups, about what that's like. is it a turnaround, right? Where you're expected to come in and just turn the business around? Is it more about accelerating growth? So, the business is plodding along. They just want to speed up revenue or profits. What's the R? How did I forget the R? I can't even read my own writing. How embarrassing.
That's okay.
It's realignment,
Really.
right?
Oh,
Where
okay. I was trying to remember too.
Yeah, it's realignment, where I think a lot of times realignment, I find, is that the organization is doing a reorg, and that means that the function or the business that you lead has to change how it works within the greater organization. And the last one, which I find is probably the rarest, is just, sustaining, so that the business is doing great. You're there to be just a caretaker, right? It's not like, so that's probably out of the 5, that's the one that doesn't require change. So I don't know, Micah, Dana, anything to add to that in terms of, is your role really to do a startup, a turnaround, accelerate growth, realignment, or just sustain the business?
Yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts that come to mind, and part of what I love about our conversations and hearing our own stories and experiences working with different leaders is that there isn't one recipe. There's not like one right way to approach any of these things. There's so many variables and so many factors that come into play. But starting with knowing what's expected of you is such an important part of being able to know whether you can be successful or not in the role. And hopefully knowing what's expected of you before you accept that offer, before you jump into a new organization or into a new leadership role, you would want to know what's expected of you. Am I going into a startup or some of these other situations? So I think, for one, that setting expectations and knowing what success looks like, that's a perfect acronym for how to gauge that. But that's still just like one factor. You bring to a new situation like that your own set of experiences and strengths as a leader that will either fit really well with what's expected of you and what the definition of success looks like, or it might actually be a mismatch, and you might have to work harder to accomplish what might come more easily to somebody else. So I just, hearing you talk about some of these frameworks, H, makes me think about all of these leaders that some of them are going into certain similar situations, but the variables are so different that they can't approach it all the same way. It's like you have to know what strengths you bring to the table and what situation you're getting into to feel comfortable knowing that you can achieve success. That's part of, it's the challenge, but it's also the fun of leadership in my perspective.
Yep, agree.
Yeah. And I think that is the biggest thing that I was just talking to a leader this morning that's interviewing for another position, and she started feeling not as confident. And I think it's that confidence. And we had the discussion about her strengths and how she's got something that no other people have. So don't even compare yourself. When you were talking, Mike, it made me remind myself to tell people, do not compare yourself to anybody else.
It's hard. I see that a lot too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Well, I
so
think we
important.
admire in other leaders the things that are harder for us.
Yeah.
And we don't always realize that they're doing the same to you. They admire in you the things that you do well that they don't. And it's hard not to compare yourself to other leaders when you see what works for them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
100%. So when you think about, when we're talking about your role as a leader, right, and the 5 situations we just talked about, all of them except the sustain require you to be an agent of change, for you to lead change. And one of the things so that's what, 4 out of 5 is 80% of the situations
Nice.
are, right? So one of the things that we were talking about is how leading change is important, especially when you're a new leader, right? And so John Kotter has the model that's probably been around for, I think it was the late 80s. And I find that there's other models. I find that one's pretty good in terms of, just if you're in charge of a department and a function and you've got to lead change, there's some good principles there. And the first one, is really, you have to assess the current situation. right? I mean, if you've been told it's one of those four, right? The startup, turnaround, accelerate, or realignment, you've got to you've got to get up to speed quickly to see what the current situation is. And when I work with organizations, so I'm working with this organization right now that wants to transform HR, and we're in the discovery phase, right? Really doing the current assessment. And I almost think that when you do change at the department or functional level, or even the organizational level, you can't, before you change the structure, you have to understand people's roles and responsibilities. To do roles and responsibilities, you have to understand process. And to understand which processes are important, you need a strategy. And to develop your strategy, I always say I try to make it as simple as possible. You have to do a gap analysis. What's your current state and what's your desired state? And that's where we are. And I think that's when I talk about assessment, which is the first stage of change. It's understand what's the current state and understand where you need to go. And I think a lot of times we get really internally focused and only talk, like do a SWOT analysis and only talk about what's wrong with our function in our department, as opposed to what's going on externally as well, right?
Yeah, I was just talking to someone this morning about the idea that a lot of leaders feel like you have to make a splash right away, and I think a lot of that comes from a what's the word I'm thinking? I think it comes from self-doubt or self-consciousness. When you go into an organization and you feel like you have to make a splash or show your value that quickly, but confident leaders who know their value, who know their worth, and know what they're capable of, can pace themselves, kind of the way H was describing, and even just the whole concept of the book being the first 90 days. It's not the first 9 days, it's the first 90 days. That's a really long time to let yourself sit back and observe and discover and do some analysis and do some interviews, find out what's going on, find out where you would have the greatest impact, what needs to change, what doesn't need to change. I think being able to have confidence in your abilities and think about it in 90-day increments, not 9-day increments. You don't go in making a splash in areas where you don't need to. You're really making good, deliberate decisions as a leader, and you impact a lot of people in that way too. So I think it's wise to think of the 90-day period versus a shorter make a splash kind of mentality that some leaders feel pressured to do.
Well, and I just to build the thing while you're doing this assessment, right, which is about the function, you should be focused on your team, because your team, the people that work for you, and the team you're on. So if you report to if you're let's say you're the you're the CFO and you report to you also have to work on being the newest member of the executive team. The thing that you have to realize is both of those teams, your team and the team you belong to, are in the forming stage because you're new. So how do you move that team forward, especially your team? If you're going to do change and you're doing this assessment, at the same time, you need to work on building trust, because that's the driver, or psychological safety for teams to be high performing. Trying to do change with your team and they're not in norming or high performing is it's not a recipe for failure, but it will undermine and take longer to do the change. And so I find it's fascinating that when leaders come in and they want to do change, but they focus on the strategy, which you should, but maybe not, as to Micah's point, not in the first 9 days. I would focus my early efforts on the team and the team development. Because the other thing is you've got to have a team that is fairly high performing. Oh, by the way, if you're going to change stuff, they're going to be fearful and less trusting. So how do you do that? I think that's the real balance.
And two, when you brought up trust, and what is the simplest way to build trust is listening, right? Just listening and going on a listening tour of your people and of the people you're going to be working with. And I think that goes back to what is the current state, just listening. And to Micah's point, you're not going to come in and make all these changes right away. But if they know that you're setting clarifying goals of just listening for these first 90 days and seeking to understand and building, then they're not going to feel like you're coming in to go, oh, what's this person going to do? There's because people see change as loss, and how do you help them
Yeah.
see change as, oh, I'm here, but I'm just going to listen and I'm going to learn right now, and I'm going to be asking a lot of questions, and I care, and I want to build this space for you to have that psychological safety, and that's it. And just even if that's a clarifying goal, that's a clarifying goal. Here's what I'm going to be doing, and
Yeah.
here's what it's going to
Yeah.
look like. Instead of thinking you've communicated that maybe to one or two, but how do you say that to everybody in a way that people can kind of take a breather and go, oh, okay, she's just listening, or he's just going to listen to me right now and
Yeah.
gather all the information.
Well, and I can hear Dana's leadership style in this too. Like coming from executive leadership at Southwest, like
Yeah.
I could hear that that's the way that you approach things.
Yeah.
I often have a perspective in the coaching that I do where I will step back from a situation like this, hearing Dana's leadership style come through, and think about it like I would do that a little bit differently, and other people would do it differently, and that's okay. That's part of
Mhm.
what I think the beauty of having strengths-based development as a tool for leaders, where that kind of comes from. Because I expect that some leaders will hear you say that and be like, I would be terrible. That I'm not a good listener. I'm not good at
Mm.
that kind of thing. I'm more of a command and control. I could
Mhm.
not pull that off the way that Dana could. And going back to H's two, if we're talking about functional and team assimilation, functional being like, what do we do? What is actually expected of us in this department, in this role, in these roles? And the team, like, how do we work together? I can think about how different leaders with different strengths would approach how they do those things. And H said that
Mhm.
too. How do I go about assimilating functionally and team wise?
Mhm.
Because the outcome is more important than the method. And I often use the question with, and I think everybody has a version of this question that I'm about to say, but I'll often ask leaders to think about the outcome you want to achieve, and then ask, how would someone with my strengths achieve that
Mhm.
outcome? If I'm trying to become familiar with the functional, I'm trying to do functional assimilation, what is it that we do? If I have high context, I'm going to go look in the histories. I'm going to look in the
Mhm.
archives. I'm going to go see what have we done in the past and learn from the past before deciding what to do in the future. If I've got high relator, I might go do interviews one-on-one with everybody on my team. If I have high includer, it might be do a focus group and have everybody come to
Mhm.
me and gather input. And it's cool for me to think about how, when we know that these are the things that need to be done,
Right.
how they get done can
Can
be
be different.
different for different leaders.
But
Absolutely. That's a great point.
I
Yeah.
think, Micah, that also illustrates one of the principles of strengths, and that is not to be well-rounded, which is
Yes.
why having a team that and putting together a team with you on the change makes all the sense in the world, right? So if you go back to Cotter, it's you do the assessment, you put a team together, and the third thing, and I think this is one of the most difficult, is you got to establish a sense of urgency behind the change, right? And
Mhm.
Yeah.
that you should come out of that assessment you've done to go, hey, the business is on fire. I just had this happen with a client where the CEO stood up in front of them, and this was the next level of leaders, like 40 leaders. And the CEO was like, I don't think you understand the sense of urgency here.
Mm.
And that if we're not turning this business around and we're not playing our roles, then, some of us aren't going to be here.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That was as clear as
Yikes.
and honest as you could
Mhm.
say it,
Right.
and I think that, but I think also when you have the team and they're working together on the assessment, they uncover the sense of urgency for themselves. It's not
Absolutely.
just my sense of urgency. And then once you've created that, you've got a team that you trust, you've got a sense of urgency. It's like, okay, now what? What does that future look like? What is the desired future state? And then it's putting the plan together to get to progress to that future state. And the two keys there that Cotter talks about, and I find it's true when I'm doing change work, is one is you've got to find ways to remove barriers.
Yeah.
That's your job. It's also
Yeah.
I find one of the things I find with leaders is that they spend too much time leading their department and function and not enough time at the next level. Your
Mhm.
team should be running your department and function. Your job should be getting being like, say, if you, again, the CFO example, the CFO's job is not to run finance. The CFO's job is to make sure finance has share of voice and is visible at the organizational level and to serve on that executive team. And I think that's the real reason that you have that, because that if you play that role, then you are much more likely to remove barriers because you can remove them at the organizational level with the peers at that level.
Yeah.
So same thing if you're on a brand, right? And you're the brand manager and you've got assistant brands working for you, your job is to work on the marketing team so that you can get those cross functions. So
that requires a lot of trust, downward trust.
100%.
And
a lot of
your
empowerment.
Team is empowered to take care of it.
Yeah. And Micah, you know what, the thing I tell leaders every time I do a team session or a new leader assimilation, my first principle, if you don't know what to do, you will do what you know. So right. As CFO, I know how to lead finance. I don't know how to be an executive, or I know how to manage a brand. I don't know how to be a member of the marketing leadership team. And I think that's the other thing that, which goes back to your earlier points, is when you don't know what to do, you do your strengths.
Yeah.
And the thing is that our strengths can, we can have we can have the base, but sometimes they don't align with the situation, which again reinforces the need to have a team. And then the last thing, and I think this is really important, and I think too often we wait till the end of the change to celebrate, but it's really, recognizing short-term wins. And short-term wins, by the way, can be progress. Short-term wins can be the team actually just trying something and failing and being honest about it and seeing it as a learning opportunity.
Yeah, I love that.
And I think that's, to your point, people want to hurry up and get stuff done. It's like, I feel more energy when I'm executing, if I can get it done. And instead of thinking about, well, let's take time to celebrate what we just did instead of moving on to the next thing.
You
right?
mean like those with achiever and
Achiever,
responsibility?
high achiever, right? That's
achiever's what number one, right? It's the most common. So we see lots of achievers, and they are on to the next.
And their team is like, well, I don't feel like I'm being appreciated for what, or you're not recognizing me. Well, why are we spending so much time on the non-performers on our teams and not as much time on the high performers, right? If a non-performer, you have to do all this stuff to get them kind of up to speed. And then the high performers keep going, well, nobody's recognizing me or spending this kind of time with me. So how do we do that? You've got some great high performers you don't want to lose in the midst of all this change. So I think that's something key to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. We have not gotten a single comment from anybody listening. Those are my favorite. I love it when we get a little comment pop up and we have to answer questions or comment on someone else's thoughts. If anybody's listening and you've had any takeaways or observations or thoughts yourself while you've been listening, we want to see those.
Yes, absolutely.
Now that we're almost out of time.
Yeah, now that we're almost out of time.
Yeah.
But I think that was great, H, as you talked through the Kotter whole role of what it would be like to assimilate as a leader and take that leader through that process. So what do you think is the area that is left out mostly with leaders when you go through this with your different teams? What do you think that they rush through or that they don't spend time enough on?
You know what, Dana? I think the answer depends on their strengths, right? So I see those with execution want to get the strategy in place and they just want to go do it.
Yeah.
So they don't spend enough time doing the assessment, and they don't spend enough time. They also don't spend enough time team develop. Whereas those that are strong in, like Micah said, like relators, those that are strong in relationship building, work on the team development, but don't address the functional. Maybe that's a way to think of it, is the balance, right? That execution and strategic thinking will focus on the functional and not necessarily on the team. Influence, I think, is the one where they may actually focus on their next level, the team that they're on, but may neglect those that work for them. So, that's probably oversimplifying it, but I do think that, watch your blind spot. And again, I think it goes back to, we're not advocating you be well-rounded. We're advocating that you have a team so that you can do all of so you can rise to the challenge. See what I did there?
And I
Yeah.
think
So proud of it.
You know, that's
when you
so bad.
when you talk about blind spots, I was thinking about the new manager report that you can order
Mhm.
with your strengths. And I think it really gets into,
Yeah.
as a leader, how do you manage these blind spots? How do you navigate when things aren't, when you find yourself in a challenge like that? And I think that is what we're saying here is there's no specific rule book for transitioning as a leader. It's based on who you are and what you're made of and your talents, and go there first and understand yourself first so that you can navigate. Let's put the oxygen mask, navigate who you are so that you can serve all the other people and then get to know them.
Yep.
That's exactly where my head went to. Is this is all? I mean, if we were to summarize this, it all comes down to self-awareness.
Yeah.
And what I've noticed is like nobody wants to admit to accept that they may not be as self-aware as they could be. And it is the most refreshing thing when a leader seeks me out as a leadership coach and says, I just want to understand myself better so that I can get the most out of myself and the most out of my team. That that is like such a signal to me that this is a coachable leader, because when I've had to work with in the past non-coachable leaders who don't want to admit that there's room for improvement. They are adamant that they know themselves very well and that they don't have any room to grow in those areas. They don't see growth. We don't see progress. They stay the same and they're not as effective as leaders as they could be. And so it takes a lot of humility and self-honesty to accept that there may be things still that I can learn about myself that would make me better at achieving my goals and overcoming my obstacles.
And
Yeah.
H, for last minute thoughts, what you would want to leave with the group today as you think about this.
Yeah, I think it's knowing your role, and I think, and to Micah's point, knowing your strengths, right? So your role, if you think about the assimilation on three levels, one is the function, and your role there is a change agent. Know what you have to do to change. You know, is this a startup to is this a turnaround? Then know that how to do change, right? And we talked about Cotter's model and one of the keys to that is creating a sense of during the assessment, create a sense of urgency, but probably just as important is putting together a team. And then that's in your functional. On the team role, really knowing that you're in the forming stage and spending time in team development and building trust will get you to a team that is more productive and also confident enough to take on the change that you've assessed and that you want to make. So
I love that. That's great. It looks like we have several comments now. So thank you, Micah, for cheerleading us on there. One of our participants said it's refreshing. It takes courage, especially to be vulnerable as a leader. And I love that. Yeah, you have to be vulnerable, but know that it does take courage sometimes just to step out there. And especially when you're transitioning into a new role and new people and understanding all of them. So thank you for that. Any other last comments, Micah or H, before we close out today and kick off our next topic?
Yep, that was great. Good
Yeah,
conversation today.
good
yeah,
job. Yeah, so thank you, H, for leading us today. Again, we're here every 2 weeks, so we would be here again on the 30th of May, and I'll have to check with my buddies to make sure
Yeah, that's
that's a
Memorial
Memorial
Day.
weekend.
Huh.
So we'll have to
oh, that
see.
is Memorial Day. Oh
Yeah,
yeah.
so
Yeah,
we'll
we're
have to
going to be
see.
traveling, so I'll have to do
Okay,
it later
so
that week
we'll
if we can.
probably move to that first week in June,
Oh, that's a
and
good idea.
let's do that. And that way
Yeah.
we'll be here. But we're normally here every 2 weeks. We've been talking about what it's like to transition, whether you're a leader and you're in between jobs, or you're a leader and you're transitioning into a new role, or you're transitioning other people into your team. And so, great conversation today. We're going to get into values and how your values are important as you get into transitioning, and what those look like and how you can stabilize with your values. So that'll be our next topic. as we get into that first week of June. But please feel free to reach out to any of us on LinkedIn. We would love to hear from you. We would love questions, comments, thoughts, and just really appreciate everyone being here today. So, and thanks again, H, for guiding us, and Micah for being here. It's awesome.
Yeah,
My
our
pleasure.
pleasure.
Thanks, Dana.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Yeah. Okay.